Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Capstone series.
Hello! This time we're talking about Soul Blazer.
I'm very excited for this.
Yeah, or Soul Blader if you're in the Japanese version, which
If
I
you're
think
a
is
purist.
the question that is at the heart of this is why should we care about this old-ass game in the modern day, especially game designers. If I had to recommend this game for one thing aside from the story, for one thing for like modern game designers, it would probably be the level design and how every dungeon level is a conversation and an argument for the mechanics.
So before we really dig in, let me first answer your question of like why people should, I think, care about Soul Blazer. And obviously I think people should care, which was why I introduced it just before because we're going to dig deeper into everything I'm about to say, but just to give people an impression of overall why I think people should care is you already touched upon the combat design and the interesting stuff it does with positioning as a top-down action RPG. I think is also a great example. Is not just got a lot of good examples of design, but also a great example of working with limited resources at the time, of innovation in very early in the Super Nintendo's life cycle, of working within the limited toolbox of what they were capable of at the time, and just lots of interesting choices around that. And then the other thing I think people should appreciate is what I think is fascinating about the Quintet trilogy and their other games is the themes that they decide to tackle and the stories that they try to tell. And especially for Soul Blazer being so early in the Super Nintendo's lifestyle, you can already lifespan. I mean,
Lifestyle.
Lifestyle.
They have a middle class lifestyle.
Yeah, very 90s wearing jorts. What for something in 92 they've got they wanted to tell a story of a game with themes of light and darkness being intertwined, a villain who sees like reincarnation as suffering, the corruption of greed, and dealing with mortality with the gnomes. These are all themes that they revisit in later games as well, and much deeper. And one of the reasons that I think Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma are so great is how much more they explore those themes. But just to see them already hitting on such topics in the 1992 Super Nintendo game, I think is fascinating and worth looking at. And because it was such an overlooked game, I think it's worth bringing to people's attention. And we're going to be digging deeper into all those topics.
Yeah, I especially want to mention how it looks like they designed the story structure of the game around that theme. So something that I think both of us experienced was the first level felt a little bland, except for the talking flowers and stuff. But the character Lisa, as soon as you jump inside her dreams and experience like all of her friends in the world, and her relationship with her father and the painting of evil, kind of like showing how the themes are going to coalesce. Like every world has a different discussion on that theme. Like how the dwarves in particular have a discussion how short life is, and the mermaids have a discussion on the corruption of individuality. And I feel like the birds and the nature has a discussion of how death is natural and how it's okay to accept that. Oddly, the second level is acceptance, more or less, and then it moves on to how technology is evil in Dr. Leo's lab. And I don't really know the lesson in Magrid's castle except for greed is bad.
It goes back to how terrible a negotiator the king is. It's like, okay, here, Death Toll, seal this away. That's a dead dog. Come on, can't you give me at least like half a gold piece for it? I'll give you a quarter of a gold piece for the dead dog. Sold!
Or alternatively, greed is good in my interpretation, where the speculative investor always wins.
This guy believed that something like this would happen, and it worked out for him.
He's like King Megrid did nothing wrong.
Speak up, thank you very much. I will build statues of you and Dr. Leo in the center right down.
Using that money I got from selling people.
Yeah, like, this all worked out for him. He's like, I made a speculative investment, and it all worked out.
Yeah, I made a risky wager. I invested in selling souls to Death Toll, and you know what? It paid out in the long game. And it might have seemed like it went belly up in the short term, but in the end, the savvy investor wins again.
Well, if you were to ask my opinion, I think Dr. Leo's laboratory is, even despite, and I actually attribute this more to translation, I don't think Dr. Leo Laboratory or even the game itself is saying technology is bad, it's supposed to be a warning about where technology can take us. Because in the finale, and if we didn't already put this in the description, we're going to spoil everything covered in our videos, so spoiler alert. But like in the finale, you talk to Marie and she talks about how the tools were happy just to be involved and be used and make something interesting and new, and it was more about what was built that was an issue, like toilets. Sorry, it's a joke. And then the act of technology or creation itself, especially because Dr. Leo, the inventor who made the machine that summoned evil, is very much like the Jesus of the game. I mean, I hate Jesus analogies, but just in the sense that he's like this, he's the good guy. He's the best person, almost infallible, except for like the mistakes he made. And he's the inventor. So I don't think technology is evil is the message. And if I had to guess for King Magritte, I mean, it's definitely Magritte Castle. It's definitely greed as a huge part of it, because we finally confront the man whose greed spurred everything forward, and his wife's greed after she was corrupted, which it's one of the beats I still feel is a bit weak personally. But also I think that when you like think back on all the other dungeons, the only two human settlements is Grass Valley Village and Magritte Castle. So I think Magritte Castle is more exploring what happened, how human civilization interacts with this world.
That makes sense to me. I still feel, as you said, I still feel like I already understood the message that was going to happen at Magritte Castle from the as soon as we heard about King Magritte, and we heard about the fact that he basically traded human lives for money. I actually find Death Toll a much more sympathetic character than Magritte. Even though Magritte gets out scot-free in the end, that bastard.
And then blames it all on his wife, which is, I think, the weakest part of the story.
Yeah.
I know they were trying to do something about, like, corruption and stuff, but, like, in my mind, it was a weak element. But again, this is a very old game, and it's probably a sign of its time. But that's, I think, the weakest part of the story. Yeah,
something else that I found really interesting with the story was each beat is handled very succinctly. I get maybe 3 sentences of dialogue that touches on the theme, but I get it from that. I can kind of connect where they're going. Obviously, a lot of the levels were chosen because they were tropes at the time. The underwater level, I find it fun that the underwater level and the fire level are sort of the same level. But aside from that, like, I see that they're playing within the tropes that are expected of a fantasy genre at this time, and I imagine that with Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma, that actually won't be true, that they'll be able to do more creative stuff outside of the tropes.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah, something that we kind of passed over was the fact that since there are only 2 human civilizations and everything else in the world is kind of talking to you, including a bloody chair, and the first thing that talks to you is actually a flower, and how it kind of talks about the sacredness of nature, the sacredness of tools. This game very much, all the games very much feel like they're inspired by a Shinto mentality of everything has a soul. Everything has a soul that is taken care of. I don't think that this game is Shinto. I think it's just inspired by a Shintoist culture, more or less. Because it's completely okay with having like plates that can talk to you, or just a drawer that has an opinion about how you hang clothes in it. Things like that.
You call one of the drawers the Genki girl of the game, which is one of my favorite jokes, when it was just jumping up and down.
She was so energetic and happy. How can you not be inspired?
But another thing, since we're diving into the story first, I do want to also say that I think the story is very minimalist, which, again, for a 92 Super Nintendo is very typical of the time. We were still very much coming into really more fleshed out game narratives, and with us starting Illusion of Gaia, you really, from the outset of Illusion of Gaia, you can tell it's much more story focused and character driven, which for me is a huge improvement. But I think within the confines of what was expected at the time, Soul Blazer does a lot with its, I think the best term to describe it is minimalist approach to storytelling.
Yes, I would agree completely. Like 3 lines of dialogue, get the entire theme.
In terms of like important, like everything's done kind of like that dialogue. And if you had to pick like quote unquote cutscenes, there's a little bit with where you meet Lisa in the first village. Then there's the part with Dr. Leo at the end and the Queen, which is very much kind of the climax in the sense of that more so than the world of evil itself is the climax of the plot, the culmination, I should say, of the plot, of the rising action to the battle with Death Toll. Because like the last dungeon's fairly short, like the real dramatic conclusion, or the dramatic culmination of everything that's been happening, is when Dr. Leo tries to escape to fix his mistakes and is stopped by the Queen.
Yeah.
And sacrifices himself to let the hero continue and right the wrong that he wasn't able to.
That said, the dialogue with Death Toll as he takes on his final form, I consider probably the single strongest moment of the game, despite the fact that I totally agree with you that Dr. Leo sacrifices the climax.
Mantis again, isn't it? The poor creature that repeats transmigration of the soul and cannot die. I will put you in a deep sleep.
I'm Batman. Some people believe being constantly reincarnated means everlasting suffering.
I mean, you're not wrong.
Being alive is suffering for some creatures. You will find out what I mean.
Yeah, no, if Death Toll had more of a presence, I would say that speech would mean something more. But because that conversation is literally our only interaction with him and our only insight into his character, it's interesting but not as powerful as Dr. Leo, who we've been literally pretty much following the entirety of the game. We're talking to his pets and friends. He's the one who painted the painting that we dive into in the beginning. We meet his daughter in the first village. He's the one whose arc we're really following. And even though we know about Death Toll from the beginning, like, his motivations are never really explored other than that speech, which I do think is fascinating. The fact that he views reincarnation as suffering and believes that by destroying everything, he's solving the problem of suffering. I do find that very interesting, but it's not given enough time, I feel, to be as powerful as Dr. Leo's journey and his story.
That's fair. That's very fair. But speaking of Dr. Leo's journey, we also have to talk about our journey as the servant of God, who eventually hooks up with Dr. Leo's daughter. I believe her name was Marjorie?
Joking aside, I really liked that aspect of it and that ending. I mean, it did feel like, it's, again, the product of its time. It's typical for it, and forced romance. You can look up the TV trope of that on it, but plus with a silent protagonist. But
hey girl, I'm the boy of your dreams. I know, because I invaded them.
Yeah, but you even said it when we played it, like, that ending is surprisingly powerful, again, for such a minimalist story. And even though it's really tropey, it still even nowadays, it still feels kind of fresh, even though if you really step back, it's kind of cliche. Lister rejects his divinity to be with the girl, but, like, the way it's handled cinematically, the way that the goodbyes are said, the fact that it, like, waits a year before and after the credits before you see the person show up, you see speak up, or the avatar show up again. I think it still felt fresh even today.
Yeah, I was pretty happy with the ending. Like, I think that the fact that it was tropey added to it. Like, I don't need a completely novel ending if it just delivers the experience that I want out of it, which I think is the thing that this game does really well. Like, it delivers a interesting experience from the story and the way that the plants interact with you and the machines talk to you and the goats hit on you, to all the way to the end where there's kind of the tropey rejection of divinity, saying "fuck you, God, I want to hang out with my girlfriend," and then King Magrid saying, "We thank you so much for your service. We made a statue out of the chump change that we got from selling everyone's soul. And I'm going to go back to ruling. By the way, we're looking for I
totally learned a lesson.
I totally learned a lesson. By the way, we're going to go to war with someone to steal their money. Do you want to get into my army? Because I know you can fight."
I do appreciate that after that, you literally see Nome the snail, who just goes, "The king's an asshole."
Yes! King Magrid, the king we can believe in. But yeah, the experience delivered for me as a player, throughout was interesting. Both, I'm not used to talking to toasters, like in a fantasy RPG that I was taking straight for a while, and I wasn't expecting to. I guess because of that, the tropes hit harder. It felt like it was coming at me at unexpected directions, but the logical map in my head of the mechanics just going moment to moment was what really kept me engaged and kept me actually very interested. Like, I was very interested to go from story piece to story piece, but I was also very interested to see what they would do in the new dungeons. Probably as soon as the second dungeon happened and the giant snakes appeared that jumped out of the pool, and they taught you to do the Big Brother strategy that you learned in the first one. Oh, the Big Brother strategy. So it turns out that you can, the first thing that the game teaches you is that you can just hold out your sword and poke an enemy with it and say, I'm not touching you from outside the pillar. And I think that was very intentional, because it teaches you a couple very fundamental things. It teaches you that positioning is very important. They want you to hang outside the pillar. The best way to handle enemies is to kind of like go to the side, and it's totally valid in this game to just stick out your sword and have it so that the enemies will just run on it as they come on by. And that's like the way you handle the first dungeon. And that kind of gets like swept aside by the end, and in Illusion of Gaia they just don't let you do that. So they probably decided that they wanted to expand upon that and make the combat more visceral than just like handing out your sword. But I did a couple mental gymnastics on where the best positioning was, especially since the opponents who spawned and moved forward took a while in order to actually gain the ability to be hit. And some of them would vanish, regain their health and come back, and I would need to swipe at them in order to do the maximum amount of damage.
So let's dig into this more, but before we start talking about combat and positioning, which I totally want to dig into, I do want to say one last thing about the story. When you're talking about how like the tropes really you felt the tropes and they resonate with you, I think that again is a testament to the strength of how Quintet explores themes, because it's one thing to be talking with a rose that just says, go here and fight the bad guy. But it's another thing to be talking to a rose that talks about the loneliness of existence when the entire world's sealed away. And like, I think it's because so much of the, again, minimalist dialogue and story hits upon such, in some cases dark, but also like really resonant, mature themes that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a game like this, that caused what might be normally just considered a trope to resonate so strongly. But yeah, let's dig into combat, because the game's all about positioning, and that crab walk is just a fundamental. I honestly don't know of any other game that does something like that. Where maybe some more recent games on the PC, but honestly, nothing on the Super Nintendo I can think of had a button to hold your position, because so much of the game's top-down combat is that positioning that you talked about, both with, as we joked about, the little brother or big brother strategy where you just hold your sword out and run into them, but also like moving yourself to the left or right so that you're swinging to the left or right so that the enemies don't hit you, dealing with, and then as it gets more advanced, you've got not only fast enemies, but enemies that move in unique patterns, and then towards the end, enemies that teleport and blip in and out of existence, making timing becoming even more important, timing and positioning becoming even more important. It's just, from a design perspective, I just find the way they handled something as simple as just top-down combat and positioning, and the way they explore it, I think is one of the most interesting non-story related design aspects of the game.
Yeah, like, and they keep developing that conversation throughout the entirety of the game, and it ends just like you say a good fight, a good game should. The last boss definitely feels like a culmination of everything that I've learned about the game so far, because I have to take advantage of timing to hit the opponent in the eye or in the gem as he's firing his laser. So I have a very narrow window. His lasers dance back and forward, so I need to pay attention to their position. While at the same time, the hands... Was it the hands that were coming up, or was it like little noodles that were coming up?
He fires the lasers constantly. When he's vulnerable, he shoots out 3 fireballs, and then on the left and right are the pillars of fire that you have to destroy for him to first be vulnerable and to replenish your gem supply. So not only are you dealing with some of the most difficult dodging and positioning ever, with the lasers zigzagging depending on where you are in relation to them, and dodging the 3 fireballs, which is the most straightforward of the attacks, but you're also having to juggle resource management and adds to make him vulnerable. And yes, exactly what you said. It's what I think is an example of a great final boss, is how it really is a culmination of everything that you've learned and dealt with so far. Yeah. Juggling gem and resource management, using the final weapon that you worked so hard to get to damage him at range, dodging and positioning, all works together for a battle that I was very happy with how it went for us. The fact that it came so down to the wire that you had 1 hit left and managed to get him, I thought made for great dramatic tension. I was super happy with how that played out.
Yeah, it felt it felt exactly like the kind of combat that I needed to test my skills. I actually kind of feel disappointed because in the first form of sorry, not disappointed in the game, but disappointed in myself, that the first form of Death Toll I kind of beat by trading life with him. Instead of trying to avoid his attack and learn his pattern, I noticed that he was weak enough that I could just go over to him and wail on him. So I did that, but I really should have respected him and tried to avoid him just to get a more interesting combat out of it and figure him out. In the same token,
that's probably the weakest part of the final boss battle is just like, because the experience in the game is rationed because enemies don't respawn. So you're going to face Death Toll at that level, especially if you have to get the Phoenix for his palace to appear. So if anything, I guess maybe it's just because they wanted to make the second form so difficult, but if anything, I think the first form's too easily defeated because you really just kind of steamrolled it with just how much damage you were dealing.
Yeah, so something else that I noticed, the first form kind of felt like Ganondorf from The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time to me before he turns into Ganon. Obviously Ganon is also very easy in Ocarina of Time, whereas the Death Toll wasn't. But I wonder if this actually influenced the design of that boss in the classic Zelda 64 game, because it really felt to me like it might have. Just like I can kind of see if this game did influence things as much as I think it would, as opposed to just being kind of like standard design. The puzzles in Golden Sun feel like they're influenced by some of the puzzles here, as well as the puzzles in Illusion of Gaia. The boss feels like it influenced Ocarina of Time, and a lot of the combat just feels like an exceptional discussion of positioning and how I'm learning new things. Like right up until the end, where the snakes are dropping from the ceiling and they're implementing verticality, to like the constant dodging of walls in the last level, where I have to kind of fight these demons that are popping in and out of existence, so I need to handle timing while at the same time constantly moving due to the walls, which I pretty much failed at, but nonetheless the lesson was there. It felt like a constant discussion. I would love to try and play this game with a 0-hit rule, where if I get hit once, I'm dead.
That would be fascinating. I feel like that's totally doable because the game's very fair and straightforward in its design. But that'd be very interesting if that had... it wouldn't have happened in a game that early in the Super Nintendo's lifespan, but that would have been fascinating if they had like a hard mode.
Yeah.
That would have been very interesting to see. Do you want to talk about overall design now? I think we've...
there's one other aspect of the combat design that I'd like to talk about, which I think that wasn't done super well, but was done very interestingly, and I understood why they do it, which was the magic system.
We should talk about that.
The little ball that we basically said our souls were combined in and was our excuse to be narrators for this game. Was a circular little ball around the character that limited how your magic could be used until the Phoenix. When the Phoenix showed up, it basically threw all that out the window.
Well, it's the ultimate spell,
which
is so totally valid that it's better than everything that came before it.
Yeah, but the ball itself felt like it actually incorporated both the timing and the positioning that the game wanted you to learn. It's a
little too difficult.
Yeah, it felt over encumbered. Like I had to ask, why is this little orbiting sprite the dictation? Like there's a soul inside the damn thing that is helpful to us. So why couldn't we just tell it to go in front of us or like direct it in some way? And like narratively, it didn't make sense. Mechanically, it made sense because it's teaching you that space-time thought. It teaches you to think that way, which actually took me a while. I think it took until about episode 5 or 6 for me the game to actually click. And a lot of that was actually figuring out that, this is just a hint that I always need to be thinking in terms of timing and spacing. Just like how Dark Souls clicks when you realize like it's dodge, roll, and attack. Speaking of which, this game is just like Dark Souls. You'll hear it from me first. It's just like Dark Souls.
Well, so to talk about the magic, I think the fireball spell is easily the weakest. The arrows and like the flare were super useful.
Yes.
The other ones I think you get too late to, even though they're powerful, I think you get too late for them to be of too much use. It also doesn't help that we could have done like some of the side quests sooner and gotten some of those spells for the Magrid Castle.
Well, we straight up missed the light arrows.
Which was super useful. It was so much better than the fireball.
Yeah,
I remember. It's super useful. But also I do think it's just a bit too much brain space wise to manage. in terms of actual like rubber meets the road moment-to-moment gameplay. In terms of why they did it, though, I think the reason they went with the rotating ball was so that you could do... I mean, I do think you're right about it teaching timing and positioning, but I think, especially looking at how... I mean, we haven't even really gotten to the more advanced magic systems of Illusion of Gaia, but when I look at Soul Blazer, I think the reason they had to do the rotating ball was because they had already devoted like the shoulder buttons to the crab walk and other buttons, that they didn't have a good way for you to be able to control that and aim and position magic. And so the ball was their solution. And it's not a bad solution, but it's not ideal.
I don't know. I can think of like just having it work so that it only works when you're looking forward being a solution, but I didn't think of it as a brain space thing. It was, at some points I was paying attention to the architecture, because since positioning was so important, like you were looking for corners to hide or like how the opponents would move. And when I saw like a group of enemies, I knew that was a good time to use spells. So I sort of started to think of the spells as a good tool to use for groups or in specific situations. And I actually think that, well, if I had had the light arrows, that would have made spells much easier. And I'm actually kind of glad I didn't have that, because I was forced to think in terms of the flare in particular was the one that...
Great spell.
Yeah,
I really like that design.
Yeah, it feels like you're trapping them and you're like waiting for a specific time to just like grab them. And that to me was the quintessential spell, because like you're waiting for this thing to just get into place, and then it's like grab, gotcha. It's like an yeah. That was
very satisfying spell.
It was the quintessential spell that actually used the system really well for me. And that's what made it click.
That and the rotator spell.
Oh, that's kind of abusing the damn thing. That's like a shield in Mega Man, the skull shield in Mega Man, where it's like you can design a shield in Mega Man, and that's cool, but then eventually you design a shield that's so good it becomes the best weapon ever. Just like, oh god, in the first game with the flame. Now I'm talking about Mega Man.
Well, I actually think we covered most of the design stuff. Do you want to talk about like themes and the Quintet trilogy overall? And we started playing Illusion of Gaia, so you can already kind of see how things evolved. What are your initial thoughts on just how things changed from each, or what do you think is going to carry over? And I'll say what I know will, and point out what we'll see, what was in Soul Blazer that we'll see in the others.
So, the relationship between dark and light, the kind of weird, semi-religious, philosophical text of the that underlies the game. I'm hoping that stays, and I kind of know it does. And that's sort of the core of the enjoyment for me in terms of the story. Is like, in Soul Blazer I'm a warrior of light, but I really didn't care too much. The point was I was a warrior against Death Toll. In Illusion of Gaia so far, I am a warrior of darkness. And I am representing all that is good about darkness, and that is much more interesting to me already. Especially since my name is Will, and I can become freedom, so I know that I'm literally representing themes. So the theming in all of the games is really, really strong in terms of light, dark, and like all these forces that represent a philosophy or a worldview. Sorry?
I agree with you. Yep.
And I love that there's the weirdness of the game. So Soul Blazer jumps into the weirdness, with the first thing being like a plant and the next thing being like a chair that you can talk to. But aside from that, it feels plain, and that kind of doesn't like, it gets weirder later, but they have I felt like in Soul Blazer there was this weird disconnect where like we need to start the players off super like generic to have it be like something that they're interested in. And then like the first thing you talk to is a plant, and like everything else is generic in the first town until you get to like the World of Evil painting and Lisa, and then you're like hopping inside dreams and you're hitting on goats, and like you have talking goats, and like you're reviving the world. And about that time you're like, okay, this is still not quite weird enough, and it's, I don't know, for me it didn't really connect until the second world when there were no humans whatsoever.
Then it's like, oh, this is something interesting and different.
Yeah. And in the sequel, Illusion of Gaia, so far it's taken the same process as Soul Blazer, which is start off sort of generic, and like it did it better in my opinion.
Yeah,
just straight up.
well, two things. One, I 100% agree with you with Soul Blazer, and for me, it really didn't start to feel like it had its own personality. I think I felt it had started to have its own personality at the same time you did in the second dungeon, where it's like, oh, this is just an entire thing of animals. That's interesting. But when it really started to feel like its own thing, I've even mentioned when we were playing it, for me was the mountain with the dwarves and the snails. That was just such an interesting aesthetic.
Yes.
That I was like, okay, now I'm really starting to dig what this game's laying down. Personally, that was when I was really starting to get into it. And then like following that up with like Leo's Laboratory, and then even MacLeod Castle, it feels unique and different. That was when it really started to jive for me.
Yeah.
But like Illusion of Gaia, like even though like the first town is just like a town, it has its own personality right away. Like you immediately get like the dark space, the design is improved, the art looks unique, like it immediately has its own identity, which you don't feel right away with Soul Blazer.
Yes, like, so first, I totally agree that the dwarf village, despite the fact that I hate the dwarves and wish them all death, I did in fact find their village the moment that I felt the game. The moment that the game clicked with me on a story level was the Dwarven village.
Yeah, me
and
too.
I hate to admit that because, God, I hate them. But the entire town worth of animals was when I started to realize that this game was going to get really interesting, and I was going to enjoy, especially when you were like making a raft out of the dog's bones. That was pretty interesting.
Well, it was you convincing the raft that you were his friend by having his quote unquote leaves.
Yes, thieves.
Yeah.
But, so Illusion of Gaia totally does the intro better, because you're right, it just hits the... This
is gonna be weird.
Yeah, you start off in a church, and then you are basically instructed to go to the top of the church, where you enter a dark gateway, and you see this demonic head that informs you that you are the warrior of dark. You're basically like, I'm a little schoolboy. You go to the top and you're like, hey, and then they're like, hail Satan, and I'm like, what the fuck? This game's gonna be awesome.
Yeah, that's very true. And the game is Illusion of Gaia is where they really they went, hey, remember how we were starting to dabble with like really dark themes in Soul Blazer? Let's just go full hog on. And because like the light and darkness, again, yeah, you already know immediately, like you're playing the Warrior of Dark. Like very few games, like I think Final Fantasy 3 was one of the first ones to actually be like darkness isn't necessarily bad and it's all about balance. But like very few games ever put you in that position. And so the interplay of light and darkness, again, that's going to be in every game. Themes of fate and mortality, especially.
I can't wait. However, at this point, we are definitely building up Illusion of Gaia more than we're talking about Soul Blazer.
Yeah, we should probably move on. Then let me also just say, I think what I think makes Terranigma even better than Illusion of Gaia in some regards is how much more it especially doubles down to, less so on mortality, though again, as I've mentioned, like Terranigma didn't come to America, so it didn't get as censored as Illusion of Gaia did, but more so than the other two, I should say. Terranigma really doubles down on the interplay of light and darkness, and in a really powerful way, which is one of the parts where I think Terranigma is stronger than Illusion of Gaia, is how it does that. Though, again, like I like a lot of certain parts of Illusion of Gaia more.
Yeah.
But I don't want to spoil too many things. But yeah, I'd say the three biggest themes that really characterize... I mean, you could also say, well, that really characterizes the Quintet trilogy is the interplay of light and darkness, themes of mortality, and then themes of fate and destiny. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Though again, the religious overtones are definitely present as well. But if I had to pick three themes, I think I would pick those.
I agree completely. I think that the Quintet trilogy offers an interesting philosophical, semi-religious perspective on light and darkness and the necessity for both, and it gives an interesting philosophical experience while delivering an intensely core, interesting mechanical perspective.
But I think that's a great segue into overall impressions. So if I was to recommend Soul Blazer to someone without that wasn't based on story, I would have to, and just for like, hey, learn something about design. For me, it would be how the game uses combat and positioning, and especially, as you said, how it then expands upon that idea in each level by introducing new elements. For me, I find just the way they made positioning such a core part of the game, I don't think I've really seen elsewhere that I'm aware of. And I think it's really interesting to look at it from a design perspective. And that's what I would probably primarily recommend the game to people for if story isn't so much a thing to them.
Yeah, I would recommend both the way that they do the use positioning, the way that they structure levels in order to teach that positioning, and teach the mechanics in an interesting way, and the way that they structure their story in a similar way around the themes of mortality and the necessity of death and light and darkness. And like what we've been talking about now is how the story kind of presents an interesting experience for everyone and deals both with decent game design decisions, especially for top-down action games, as well as interesting story and theme decisions.
Yes, I'm really glad you brought that up.
Much like how every level delves deep into the theme, every dungeon level is a conversation and an argument for the mechanics.
Yes.
It is... The first level, you are hitting things, and they're coming at you straight away, and you learn the combat. The next level, you're hiding behind a corner, and things are coming at you, and they're firing like a ranged attack. The next level, there are things that are flying, and you have to kind of take position behind the pillars while something is coming at you at the floor, while something is kind of knocking you out of that position because it's flying into your position. And because of that conversation, you start learning the mechanics much better. That and crab walking. Please bring crab walking back. It is the best.
Unfortunately not, but as you've already seen in Illusion of Gaia, they add a lot more interesting other things that I think make up for the loss of it, especially including the magic system, because unfortunately removing crab walk freed up the shoulder button for the magic stuff.
It wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it.
I don't think I could say any of that better myself. I think that's a great summation of what I think makes the game good, and also what makes the later games also good.
Yeah, and I think that this series is worth a damn to anyone who wants to study anything like that. Obviously not with... actually, yeah, I bet that you could take these concepts into 3D if you worked your brain hard enough. They work best in 2D, though.
Yeah, you definitely have to make some adjustments if you wanted to make it XYZ plane for positioning and stuff.
Can you
imagine? Oh god, I'd have to sit it'd be difficult to imagine. I have to sit and really think about how best to do it, because I do really think a lot of the stuff they do in this is really clever. As much as we talk about the trilogy as a whole, and the trilogy is great, and trust me, I love Illusion of Gaia and I love Terranigma, and I can't wait till we get through them. I do think Soul Blazer on its own has a lot to offer in terms of interesting ideas and stuff to discuss. So again, when I first introduced it, it was, yes, I want us to play this so that we can use it as a frame of reference for when we go to Illusion of Gaia and then Terranigma. But I do think it is a very good and interesting game in its own right, regardless, even if you weren't going to immediately compare it to its sequels.
Yeah, I would say that it's one of those games that you could go back and issue yourself challenges. In fact, if I was younger, I would definitely do a no Phoenix run challenge of the last boss, as well as go for a no hit run. It's one of the games that's focused on mastery, and it delves deep into its theme. It definitely stands on its own. It lacks a little bit of polish, but like a lot of good games that are judged too harshly for their polish and not enough for their game design, I would highly recommend this game.
I actually would argue that it's very polished for what it is, but it lacks a lot of the I don't want to say fluff, because I usually use that as demeaning terms, but it lacks a lot of the I guess accoutrements, a lot of the additional layers of content that later games would, but I think that's more part of when it came out.
Yep.
I think what it has is very polished. I just don't think it has as much additional content as later games in the Super Nintendo's life would, and I think that's more an aspect, I think it's more representative of the top. Anything else?
Probably so. Since it looks like we've become official game reviewers now, do we want to do a thumbs up, thumbs down system, or a star system?
Let's just do thumbs up, thumbs down, because as much as I normally like attributing, I personally prefer reviews that attribute do numerical values or star values of some kind to give it a sense of scale. We made this channel to celebrate games and to introduce people into ones that they might not have heard of. And so I think thumbs up, thumbs down is probably the way to go, since it's really less about how good is this game and more of, is this something worth checking out?
All right, in that case, do you give this game a thumbs up, and who would you recommend it to, if anyone?
I definitely, obviously I give it a thumbs up because I introduced it to the channel for the reason that I think more people should hear it. So I guess I already had a thumbs up opinion of it going into this. So definitely thumbs up. I would just recommend it. Definitely there's a nostalgia factor for just the artwork and Super Nintendo games. I'd recommend it to anyone who loved Super Nintendo games, might not have played this when it was around. I'd recommend it to someone anyone who's interested in game design, because I do really think everything it does with positioning is fascinating. And I'd also just recommend it to anyone who likes games that explore the themes we discussed that it hits, because I do think it's an interesting exploration of those, though it doesn't explore them as well as like Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma later do.
Okay. I would give this game 727 thumbs up, and I would recommend this game to anyone who's interested in top-down design, older games, or just interesting conversations about light and darkness and the necessity of good and evil.
And so with that, I think that's a great way to end our capstone of our longest series so far, though I'm sure we're gonna beat it soon with either Lufia or Illusion of Gaia.
Yeah, I'm sure we will, and we'll see all of you there. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.